Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine, just for a second, a check engine light. But, not for your car. For your child's feelings. Or maybe their behaviors. What if those little signs you see, like a sudden fear pops up or a new habit, maybe they just seem a bit off? What if they aren't just quirks?
Right.
What if there's signals, like that dashboard light trying to tell you something big is going on inside?
That's a really powerful way to frame it, isn't it? The body, the brain, they're constantly sending messages. We just need to know how to look and listen.
Exactly. And that's really our mission for this deep dive. You've shared some, frankly, fascinating sources with us. Documents that go way beyond the usual chat about anxiety and depression. They explore some really surprising connections.
Yeah, things like those involuntary movements we call tics, for instance. And some conditions you might not have heard much about, especially when they show up in kids.
So our goal here is to explore this material together. We'll pull out the really important ideas and try to understand what these sources are suggesting might be at the root of these issues and, what can be done about them.
And just to be clear, this is all based strictly on the information provided in those sources you shared.
Right. We want to make this complex stuff feel a bit more accessible, give you some clear takeaways, and hopefully maybe a few of those aha moments that kind of shift how you look at these challenges. Ready to jump in.
Absolutely. And, the sources start in a place that unfortunately feels increasingly familiar for many people. That's anxiety and depression showing up in kids. Often it seems younger than ever before.
Yeah, the sources really highlight that. And they point out that while anxiety and depression are distinct things, the potential underlying reasons, they often overlap quite a bit, especially in children.
Yes, exactly. And what comes up right away is the foundational stuff. Things like, poor diet.
Okay. So like not getting the right nutrients.
Precisely. If the body doesn't get those essential building blocks from good nutrient-dense food, it really struggles. It struggles to make the brain chemicals needed for, stable mood and managing emotions.
Like trying to build a solid house, but you're missing half the bricks.
That's a great analogy. And it's not just about what's missing either. The sources also point fingers at environmental factors, exposure to toxins, maybe chronic stress.
And that connection between the gut and the brain, right? That comes up a lot.
Oh, definitely. The gut-brain axis. It's a major theme across these sources. The gut is sometimes called the second brain because, it actually produces many of the same neurotransmitters your brain does.
So if the gut's unhealthy,
it can directly impact brain function and mood. It's a two-way street.
Wow. And then there's the elephant in the room, which the sources mention pretty directly, social media. Giving kids, whose brains are still developing, access to platforms where there's bullying, stuff they shouldn't see, constant social pressure.
It's a huge stressor, something previous generations just didn't face in the same way.
And one key point from the sources is how these issues, if you don't address the root causes, can become really entrenched.
Right, because the underlying brain chemistry and the potential causes can be so similar. Anxiety often shows up alongside depression, or maybe one leads into the other down the road.
Okay, so let's go back to that check engine light idea. What signals should we be looking for in kids, according to these sources?
The sources do a good job categorizing potential signs. For anxiety, you might see behavioral changes, especially in younger kids, like maybe more clinginess, they really resist separating, or they just become less cooperative than usual.
And for teens?
Avoidance is a big one. Procrastinating, hiding out in the room, pulling back from family stuff.
Okay. And emotionally, what might that look like?
Could be crying more easily, feeling overwhelmed all the time, constant fear or worry, or just feeling kind of mentally stuck.
And you mentioned younger kids if they don't have the words.
Exactly. Anxiety can manifest physically. Things like recurring tummy aches, headaches that keep coming back, or just being tired all the time.
That's such a critical point, not just brushing off those physical complaints. The sources also laid out signs for depression in kids, which, like you said, can overlap.
Things like pulling back socially, losing interest in hobbies they used to love, or noticeable changes in eating or sleeping habits, maybe neglecting hygiene, grades dropping at school.
So how do you tell the difference between, say, normal stress about a test and something deeper?
That's a really important distinction. The sources advise looking for changes that stick around for more than just a couple of weeks. Or when the worry or the low mood is pretty constant, it's impacting their daily life, their sleep, their motivation, making them withdraw a lot. That's when you need to dig deeper.
There was a powerful story in one of the sources, wasn't there? An expert sharing their own experience.
Yes, realizing their own severe adult anxiety and panic attacks were actually linked to underlying biochemical stuff, things like hormonal shifts, a gluten sensitivity they didn't know about, even heavy metal toxicity.
And that led them down the path of looking at nutrition and functional medicine.
It really just underscores that direct link, you know? Our physical state and our mental well-being are deeply connected.
And what's really fascinating is how the sources pinpoint specific nutritional deficiencies that can play a role in anxiety.
Like low iron, for example. Your body absolutely needs iron to make key brain chemicals.
Or vitamin B6. I think the sources mentioned that gets depleted by sugar and caffeine.
That's right. And vitamin D too, which we need to make serotonin one of those feel-good neurotransmitters.
So addressing these specific deficiencies, which might get missed sometimes,
it can make a huge difference. But the sources went even deeper, didn't they? They mentioned a less common genetic thing linked to social anxiety.
Parloria. Yeah, that sounds complicated. How did the sources describe it?
They described it as basically a genetic tendency that affects how your body processes and holds onto certain nutrients, specifically zinc and vitamin B6.
Okay.
And one key insight is that you often see it in people who just naturally prefer smaller groups, feel really stressed in big crowds, or have significant anxiety about school.
And the sources said that under stress, people with pyroluria don't just use these nutrients.
They actively excrete them much faster than normal. So the more stress they get, the more depleted they become in these really vital nutrients.
Wow. So zinc and B6 are crucial for making those mood-regulating brain chemicals.
Exactly. And this chronic depletion can then directly show up as social anxiety.
So it's not just like a personality thing. There's potentially a biochemical reason for that social discomfort.
Right. And the sources even list some physical signs that might go along with it. Things like feeling nauseous in the morning, those little white flecks on fingernails, classic zinc deficiency sign nightmares, maybe even joint pain.
It's pretty eye-opening that something like white spots on your nails could be a tiny check engine light pointing to a nutritional issue affecting how you feel in social situations.
Absolutely. And if we connect this back to the bigger picture of anxiety and depression in kids, the sources really push for a multifaceted approach. This isn't usually a one-size-fits-all kind of problem.
Right. Not just putting a Band-Aid on it, as one source put it, like only focusing on medication. The emphasis is really on finding the why. Is something going on at home? Could it be an environmental thing like mold?
Or maybe a genetic vulnerability like pyroluria or something else entirely.
And while you're figuring out those root causes, the sources suggest certain amino acid supplements like GABA or tryptophan might help.
Yeah, they can provide some initial relief, kind of buy you some time while you investigate deeper issues. Gluten, gut problems, low iron, genetics.
And food just keeps coming up, doesn't it?
Oh, consistently. Research cited in the sources showed kids eating lots of processed foods have way higher rates of anxiety and focus issues compared to kids on a more traditional whole foods diet.
And gluten sensitivity gets highlighted specifically.
Yes, because it can potentially damage the gut lining, but also, according to these sources, directly impact the brain through inflammation.
Low blood sugar is another big one mentioned.
Definitely. Starting the day with protein and healthy fat, not just carbs and sugar, helps keep blood sugar stable, prevents those crashes that can trigger anxiety or make it hard to focus.
These seem like simple changes, but the sources suggest they can be incredibly powerful.
And beyond food, lifestyle is huge. Getting kids off screens, some sources almost like an excessive screen time to an addiction because of the dopamine hit.
Right. And encouraging outdoor time instead.
Nature itself has a calming effect. Physical activity, being outside, even rhythmic things like swinging can help regulate the nervous system. It's about finding healthy ways to de-stress that aren't just zoning out in front of a screen.
Sources also talk about functional testing, right? Looking deeper.
Yes, looking at things like neurotransmitter levels or genetic variations like MTHFR.
Which, just to clarify for listeners, that's a gene involved in converting folate into a form the body needs to make things like serotonin for mood and melatonin for sleep.
Exactly. And also testing for deficiencies in things like omega-3s, vitamin D, B12, all strongly linked to brain health and mood.
Finding these underlying issues allows for really targeted support.
Which often makes other things, like counseling, work much better.
And for those really intense moments like acute anxiety or near panic, the sources offer some practical tools too.
Yeah, like the 3-3-3 rule. Name 3 things you see, 3 things you hear, move 3 body parts. Simple grounding technique.
Or consciously moving your body, literally walking away from whatever feels threatening to signal safety to your brain.
Even things like cold exposure, a quick cold shower, were mentioned as ways to interrupt that anxiety cycle and maybe build stress resilience over time.
These are actionable things you can try based on this material. And we heard some really compelling stories from the sources, families finding real hope and making huge progress by looking at these deeper roots: diet, supplements, genetics, lifestyle.
Sometimes leading to kids being able to come off psychiatric medications, which is pretty significant.
It really highlights that healing often involves looking at multiple connected systems in the body. Speaking of the body sending signals, let's shift gears a bit. The sources also explored tics.
Right. Tics, those involuntary movements or sounds, could be motor tics like blinking or shoulder jerking, or vocal ones like throat clearing or making little noises.
And if a child has both motor and vocal tics for over a year, that might lead to a Tourette's diagnosis.
But the really powerful message from the sources is to see tics explicitly as that check engine light again.
Not just a quirky habit to ignore.
Exactly. They're a signal that something else is going on underneath the surface.
Like what kind of things?
The sources link tics to potential root causes, like underlying infections, exposure to mold or heavy metals, other environmental toxins, even responses to trauma.
And the concern raised is that if you ignore those underlying causes,
the tics can sometimes get worse or more complex over time.
But the sources offer hope here, too, right? Suggesting that addressing the root cause can actually reduce or get rid of the tics naturally.
Yes. And the starting point, again, is often diet. Cutting out processed foods, sugar, looking into inflammatory foods like gluten and dairy.
And the sources really stressed getting proper functional testing done.
Because parents are so often just told, oh, ignore it, they'll probably grow out of it.
There was that story about the young girl?
Yes, with severe tics, debilitating fear, sensory issues. They did extensive functional testing, genetic, stool tests, food sensitivities, and uncovered things like a parasite in a leaky gut.
And by targeting those root causes, specific diet changes, a parasite protocol, healing the gut.
She became tick-free. The fears went away, the sensory issues resolved. It's an incredible example of how interconnected these things can be.
Which brings us to maybe the most surprising connection highlighted in the sources, the really dramatic link between infections and sudden severe mental health changes, specifically PANS and PANDAS.
Yes, this is where the information gets particularly intense. PANDAS stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorders Associated with Streptococcal Infections, so strep throat.
Okay, strep. How does that connect to the brain?
Well, normally your immune system fights off strep and then calms down. But in PANDAS, especially if the child has other underlying issues like poor gut health or toxin exposure, the immune system kind of gets confused. It starts making antibodies that mistakenly attack an area deep in the brain called the basal ganglia.
The basal ganglia. Why is that important?
That's like a control center for really crucial functions: learning, emotions, planning movements, regulating sleep, appetite.
So instead of just getting over a sore throat, these kids can suddenly develop severe acute symptoms.
Exactly. Like crippling OCD seemingly overnight, extreme restrictive eating, intense anxiety, depression, new tics appearing suddenly, or even a sudden regression in skills like their handwriting suddenly falling apart. It's often dramatic and acute.
Wow. And PANS. That's similar but broader.
Right. PANS stands for Pediatric Acute Onset Neuropsychiatric Syndrome. It's very similar symptoms, but the trigger can be any infection, not just strep. Could be mycoplasma pneumonia, Lyme disease, different viruses, mold exposure, even gut infections like candida.
So the trigger isn't just strep. That makes it even more crucial to investigate why a child might have a sudden dramatic personality shift.
Absolutely. And a real challenge highlighted in the sources is that PANS and PANDAS are still often under-recognized in conventional medicine. Sometimes the link is even met with skepticism, despite the research. Kids get diagnosed just with OCD or OBB, and no one looks for an infectious trigger.
The sources shared that story about the athlete. Her brain just seemed to suddenly break after she got sick.
Yeah, developed slow processing, clumsiness, couldn't do basic math, started self-harming. She got diagnosed with OCD and anxiety, put on increasing doses of meds that did nothing.
Until she saw someone who knew about PANS.
Exactly. Testing confirmed chronic strep driving PANDAS. Once they treated the underlying infection and the brain inflammation with targeted antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, immune support, her brain was described as just snapping back within about a month.
And she was eventually able to get off the psychiatric medication successfully.
It's such a powerful example of what can happen when the true root cause is found and addressed.
So how is it diagnosed? The sources said it's mainly based on that sudden change.
Primarily, yes, that sudden, acute onset of symptoms. But it can be supported by specific lab tests, like something called the Cunningham panel, which looks for those brain-attacking antibodies, and, of course, testing for the specific suspected infections.
The sources really stress that if it goes untreated, kids can struggle for years cycling through misdiagnoses.
That acute, totally out-of-character shift in personality or behavior, especially after an illness, should be a huge check engine light to potentially investigate PANS or PANDAS.
Okay, so if there's a suspicion or a diagnosis, what do the sources suggest? It sounded like a multi-step approach.
It is. Step 1, identify and get rid of the trigger. Is it an active infection, mold, heavy metals? Testing is key here.
Step 2.
Calm the inflammation in the brain. That's a core part of the condition. Using anti-inflammatory strategies, sometimes meds during flares, but also natural approaches.
Okay. Step 3.
Support immune modulation. Basically, help the confused immune system regulate itself and stop attacking the brain.
And step 4.
Rebuild the body. Address the gut health issues that are often there, fix nutritional deficiencies, support overall balance.
And lifestyle stuff is important too, right? Like checking the house for mold.
Absolutely. Creating a safe environment, implementing an anti-inflammatory diet, often low histamine is helpful, supporting the nervous system with things like vagus nerve exercises, all critical pieces.
The sources also went into detail about using targeted detox protocols.
Yes, using specific herbs and supplements to systematically tackle underlying issues like parasites, bacteria, mold toxins, lingering viruses.
And recovery. The sources said it's not always a straight line.
No, there can definitely be flares, often triggered by new infections or even stress. But the goal is to make those flares happen less often and be less severe, building resilience over time.
That story about the boy who recovered from progressive PANDAS was really something.
Yeah, he had significant sensory problems, cognitive decline, violent rages, severe anxiety, all from chronic strep.
But by changing his diet, treating the infection and inflammation, supporting his immune system, he not only recovered, but learned lifelong skills.
He became really aware of how foods affected him, recognized his own screen dependence tendencies, developed resilience.
And that point about him not really remembering how bad it was because his brain was so inflamed.
It's almost like a protective mechanism, isn't it?
Yeah. So looking back at everything we've covered, I mean, from biochemical roots like pyroluria driving social anxiety,
to specific nutrient gaps, to that dramatic infection-brain connection in PANS and PANDAS.
it really paints this incredibly detailed picture of how interconnected our physical health is with our mental and emotional state, especially when kids are developing.
It really does.
And it offers a huge message of hope, I think, by looking past just the symptoms and really digging into potential root causes, whether it's diet, nutrients, genetics, infections, environment.
Mm-hmm.
The sources show there are often paths to real recovery, empowering kids to actually thrive.
And knowing these things empowers you, the listener, to recognize those check engine lights maybe in your own life, maybe in kids you care about, to understand there might be deeper reasons for what you're seeing, and feel more confident seeking out approaches that look at the whole picture, not just the surface stuff.
So what does this all mean when we zoom out a bit? I mean, given how deeply connected our bodies and brains clearly are, and how much things like hidden infections or our environment can affect us, it makes you wonder, right? What other common issues that we currently just treat on the surface might also have hidden root causes we just haven't looked for yet?
That's a really provocative thought to leave people with.
Definitely something to mull over.
We've covered a huge amount of ground today, drawing from all those sources, and we're genuinely curious. What stood out to you the most from this deep dive? Was there an insight that really grabbed you, or maybe a question that popped into your head based on what we discussed?
Please share your thoughts with us. Drop them in the comments section below. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into these sources. We've really unpacked a lot of the why behind these issues and identified some key what to look for signals.
And based on the material you shared, our next deep dive looks set to build right on this foundation. It seems poised to lay out more of an ultimate action plan, a roadmap for supporting kids' health using these root cause ideas.
Yeah, you absolutely won't want to miss that one. Tune in next time.